So I'm Talia. I'm a senior developer advocate at Amazon Web Services, and I've been with this team for about a year now, just working on serverless technology. And before I was a dev advocate, I was a test engineer. So I did testing for quite a long time after university. And so I'm going to talk today about everybody's favorite subject, every developer's favorite subject, their favorite thing to do, which is testing. And so, yeah, like I said, I used to be a test engineer, and a lot of times I would come across situations that staging was just not the same as production. So one of the hardest things that I experienced as a test engineer was that staging and production just were completely different. And most companies use a staging environment to test, right? Like this is normal to have a test environment. You test your code in staging, and then you deploy to production, and you cross your fingers and tap your heels 3 times and hope everything works, right? Who here uses a staging environment or a test environment? Raise your hand. Okay, now keep your hand up if staging is an exact replica of production. Okay, you're all liars, but that's okay. So using staging would always lead to so many issues, and I experienced this, all of the engineers on the team experienced this. Just using a fake environment would lead to so many problems, and these are some of the problems that I dealt with. So the data in staging doesn't match the data in production, right? So this means that test results don't always match. I used to work so hard on testing every single requirement. I would go through the product requirements in detail with the product owner. I would set up meetings way in advance of the release to make sure like I understood everything. I would work so hard to make sure that all my tests are passing in staging and that everything works really well in staging. And then as soon as we deployed to production, something would break in production, right? So there's such a horrible feeling when you spent so much time making sure that something worked in staging, and then you deploy to production and like there's a bug. It's a horrible feeling, and I'm sure you guys have experienced that too. Oops. Where's my mouse? There it is. Okay, and then the second thing is configuration drift. So let's say you are working on an application and you get paged in the middle of the night because there's an incident, like something's going on. So you open the logs and you figure out what's going on. And in order to fix what's going on, in order to fix the issue, you have to make a configuration change in production. You have to do something to your infrastructure, you have to fix something. So you make the change and you fix it in production because it's a critical bug. And then you go back to sleep because it's the middle of the night. So although you've fixed the issue, what you've done is you've created an even bigger divide between staging and production because you didn't make the same change in your staging environment. You just did it in production. So many times, staging and production are not the same because of changes made during incident management, and this is called configuration drift. Okay, I don't know if you guys know this, but the performance in staging is really bad. It's so slow, it's not the same as production, and a lot of times when you're writing tests, especially when you're writing end-to-end tests, you often have to add waits, you have to add sleep, like wait for 20 seconds before you move on because, it's staging and you don't know how long something's going to take to load. But your end users are not going to wait for 20 seconds for something to load. So the performance in staging is just not good at all, and that's not how your users are going to interact with your applications in production. And my favorite, nobody cares if staging is down. If staging, like let's say, in my example, like I would be assigned to test these hotfix tickets. Like hotfix tickets are like Sev1, super critical, like they have to get fixed right away. So I would be assigned to test these. So I would log in to my staging environment to test them. But of course, like staging would be down. You get the 404 screen of death. And then you ping the DevOps guy so that he can bring staging back. And he says they're doing, performance testing and staging. So then you have to ping someone else. And then you have to get escalation by your manager. And it's like just a domino effect of like different people that have to get involved, and all you're trying to do is fix an issue, and nobody seems to care, right? So no one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. Like, nobody cares. So what is the point of testing and staging if it's not going to give me the same test results as production? Like, why even bother? And when I was a test engineer, I was getting so fed up with all of these problems, and I was getting so fed up of being blamed when things didn't go right in production, when things broke in production, and I had spent so much time testing them and staging. And I think as a test engineer, you're constantly looked at as the gatekeeper for things, right? Like if things doesn't work, oh, it's, the test engineer didn't test it. So I thought there has to be a better way to test software. There has to be a better way to test my code, to test my applications, because my end users are not going to log into staging to use my application, right? Like my end users are going to log into production. So what are my other options? So I did a ton of homework and researched. I researched what other companies were doing, and this is some of the things that I learned. So first, I learned that it's the norm for companies to have staging environments, especially companies that are still waterfall. I also learned that most companies have more than one staging environment. So I worked at a company once that had like staging, it had beta, it had cert, it had QA, it had 5 or 6 different staging environments, and it was a nightmare. And then I learned that big name companies like Google and Facebook and Netflix and Twitter, they all test in production. And when I read that, I was like, what is testing in production? Like, how is that possible? Like, what do you mean? Testing in production means testing your features in the environment that your features will live in. So not using a dummy environment like staging or QA, but testing in the environment that your features will live in. And I thought, oh my God, this is perfect. My users are not going to log into staging, they're going to log into production. So if I can get this to work, this is going to solve all of my problems. I also learned that testing in prod doesn't mean you only test in prod. You can still use a test environment for GDPR and SOX-related, things that just can't be tested in production. A lot of very corporate, financial institutions might have to do this. There might be some reasons that you just can't test in prod. So you can use a staging environment for specific things. So it's not like an all-encompassing thing. And so I thought, I have to start doing this. This is perfect for me. How do I do this? How do I set up testing in prod? And the answer was feature flags. Feature flags, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it's a way to separate code deployment from feature releases. So the idea is you deploy your code to production behind a feature flag, you test it in production, and then you release the feature with the click of a button as soon as it's bug-free. And this is kind of what I envision it looking like. Different feature flagging tools have different UIs, but this is kind of like the gist of it. So your developers would create a feature flag from the UI, and then you target your internal teammates. This is also called dog fooding. So this includes dev, QA, product, design, anyone who needs to be able to see the feature working in production to sign off on it, to see the design of it, to see how it works in prod. So all of those people are targeted. And so anything related to this feature can only be seen by the people who are in this list. If the people on the right, like these end users, the real people, they don't have access to this feature because they're not in the feature flag. They don't see anything differently. And so while the feature flag is off, this is when you go in and you test everything. You test all of your functionality, you test your design, you go through all the requirements with your product owner, and you make sure that everything works. And if you happen to find a bug in your new feature, if it doesn't work, it's okay because your end users aren't affected. It doesn't affect them at all. You didn't deploy a bug to production for your users. It's only for the people who are targeted in the feature flag. And then once you know that your feature is working in production, you turn the flag on, already knowing 100% this feature works in production and you didn't break anything that was existing. And now your users are happy and they're dancing because you just released a perfect feature. And I thought, like, okay, like that's all wonderful. The feature flagging process is great, but you can't possibly manually test every single feature like this. There has to be a way to automate it. It's just going to take too much time if I do this manually. And so there's two options here for automation. The first one is to target your test users and automate the flows with them. So every time automation bot A logs in, they're going to have access to this feature regardless of anything else, because they're on the allow list. They can log in, they have access to the feature, and you can add them to that list that we just saw inside of your feature flag. This does cause increased fragility because, like, if someone removes that user from the feature flag, for example, it's going to cause all of your tests to break. Another option is to make a custom feature flag abstraction, which basically in your tests you mock out. So for each feature you would have 3 tests. So for the first test, you mock the feature flag on, the second you mark your feature flag off, and then the third one you say, I just want the test to run regardless of if the feature flag is on or off. Okay, and then when you run these tests in production, so like my favorite way of doing this is to have test users in production and to have them automated inside of the feature flag, and to have just a few people who are in charge of like user management and administration and resetting passwords and all of that stuff. That works well for me. And so when you do that, you want to make sure that your tests obviously only interact with other testing entities in production. I think this is where people get a little bit scared about testing in prod. So what you do is you have this back-end flagging system in production, something like is test user equals true, or is test equals true. And that way you can separate test data from real data in your dashboard. So let's say like automation bot A logs in and they click on this specific button with the attribute is test equals true, and then you go to your like data dashboard and you see like two different tables. One of the tables is like is test equals false, which is like all of your production data, your real data. One of them is test equals true, and that's like for all of your testing stuff. So you don't want to make business decisions off of things that your test is doing. If you want to get data from production, from what your users are doing, you're going to want to use the is test equals false table. So these tests are looking for specific elements with these specific test attributes in production, and if the test doesn't find it, it's going to fail, and you have to get alerted and figure out what's going on. And a way to do this is like you can use ARIA labels. You can also create your own attribute. There's a few different ways. Okay, so there's clearly exceptions to this. If your software is integrated with a third party, for example, it can be tricky to test, not impossible. What's worked for me when I did this is I created a unique header in the API request that I sent to the third party, and I said, hey, any request that you get with this header is a test, and I want you to treat it in this other way, do this other thing with it. Okay, so how do you know what to test in prod? So we have the process, we know how we're working with third parties, we know how we're separating test data and real data, but how do you know what to test in prod? So there's 2 places to look at. The first person to talk to is your product owner, and this is where you get your business critical flows. This is where you get what are the user flows that are the most important things for my business, that if these things fail, we're all going to be out of a job. So this is where you get your really important user end-to-end flows. And then you're going to look at your data. You're going to look at what are users doing the most in production. So these are 2 completely different lists. If your users are doing a specific flow more, but it might not be the most business critical flow, like there's going to be some differences in these lists, but this is where I suggest that you start. So besides feature flags, there's some other dependencies that you need. You're going to need an automation framework, again, because you can't automate everything. You can't test everything manually. You also need a job scheduler that's going to run your tests for you, and an alerting tool. And so these are some of the ones that I've used that I can recommend. So for feature flagging, I think Split is great. I also used to work at Split, so full disclosure. I've also used LaunchDarkly, very good tool. And then for an automation framework, my absolute favorite automation framework is Robot Framework. It's a Python-based BDD Gherkin automation framework, and it's just so easy to use. And then job schedulers, Circle CI, Jenkins. For your alerting tools, I really recommend when you're testing in prod to have 2 different alerting tools. So one that's like, will alert you in the middle of the night if your entire app is down, something like PagerDuty where, something really critical is down and you want to get alerted. And then have something like Slack, for example, that'll just send you notifications like, all your tests pass, you're good to go, like nothing needed, no other actions needed. Okay, so this new process, this all made sense to me when I was researching it, when I was figuring out how to do what I was supposed to do. But if it's so simple, why isn't everyone testing in production? Why is this not a common thing for everybody to do? Why do staging environments still exist if you have this process that literally solves all of your problems? And the answer is that people are scared. Companies don't test in production because of fear and lack of trust in their systems. And for the same reasons, they refuse to engage in the tools and the process changes that are going to generate that trust. They're too afraid of the risks. And so there's a few things that you can do to mitigate the risks of testing in prod. We talked about one of them before. So using feature flags before you launch. Again, in this process, you target your internal teammates, test with them, and then turn the feature flag on, already knowing that your features work in production and you didn't break anything that was existing. And if there's bugs, then either you turn the feature flag off and you go fix it and you do it again, or you fix it right there with the feature flag on because your users don't have access to it. The next thing that I suggest is using a canary release. So this is a percentage rollout. And basically it allows you to release your features to a small subset of users before you release it to everybody. So if something does go wrong with this process, would you want it to affect 1% of your population or 100%? So this is just another way to have that security. Another thing you can do is start with an AA test, which means you give both sets of users in and out of the feature flag the same experience. And then you make sure that the data coming in is the same for both. And this is going to build your confidence in the feature flagging system. Oops. I think I missed one. Yeah. So then the last thing is you want to start small, right? So you don't want to start with the most complex flow that you have and say, I'm going to test this in production. You want to start small, start out with, a CSS change, something very small, and then work your way up to the more complex changes once you guys have confidence in your system, once you have confidence in the feature flagging system, once you have processes put into place. Okay, so the outcomes of this process were really incredible. So you can release faster because you're not tied to a specific release night. I hear a lot of people on Twitter saying that they really just can't release on Fridays. Yes, you can. You can release anytime you want on any day. You can also develop faster. So basically your developers spend more time creating new features and less time fixing bugs because all of those bugs are caught ahead of time. They're all caught ahead of time, and then the developers can go on to work with new features. You also have an increased confidence in releases, right? There isn't this hesitancy when you deploy a feature to production because you already know that it works. You tested it in production. And obviously, this makes everybody really happy. Okay, so if I haven't convinced you that this is a good idea, I want everyone to think of the last feature that your team deployed. Okay, everyone has that feature in their head. You're thinking about it. Is it working? Right now? In production? How do you know? Your users haven't alerted you, your alarms haven't gone off, no one's paged you, but how do you know? How do you really know? Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working in production right now. And a lot of times the hardest part of this is just convincing people that it's a good idea. That's been the case with me, is just that initial bump of this is a good idea and we should do it. It's a culture shift. So shifting your company's testing culture is a lot of times the hardest part of this process. So something that's helped me is to use examples from your past. So, when you're talking to your teammates, to your manager, like, hey, do you remember when we released this thing and it broke our entire application? Like, do you remember when we tested this feature so thoroughly in staging and it was working perfectly and then we released it to production and it broke? And then again, I would just say start using feature flags. Like most platforms, I know Split and LaunchDarkly both have like free versions where you can go in and use the platform and kind of experiment before you actually decide to use them. Okay, and in case you haven't been paying attention at all in the past 30 minutes, I want you to take away two things. Nobody cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. And the only way to know if it's working in prod is to test it in prod. Thank you, everybody. That's my talk. Thanks. I tried to get through it like pretty fast because I know this is the last talk of the day, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. I know, I just blew you all away. So much information. It was so wonderful. And you guys all want to go drink some port wine, so enjoy the rest of your time.